Giuseppe is a high school teacher at the Music Institute in Val Camonica. After philosophical studies at the University of Padua, he obtained a PhD in human sciences at the Guglielmo Marconi University of Rome. His thesis was focused on the thought of Schelling. His today's lecture is titled Diese Unruhe, aber das Selbst, Spinoza and Hegel between time and eternity. Giuseppe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My presentation is prompted by a suggestion regarding some fundamental questions of Hegel's philosophy and their direct or indirect relationship with that of Spinoza. And the first question concerns love. As is known, the meticulous systematic articulation of Spinozian epistemology culminates in the amor dei intellectualis, that is, in the coincidence of the human mind with the idea of the latter in God. In the Ethics, love is defined as a joy in conjunction with the idea of an external cause. This means that for Spinoza, the supreme condition of freedom and wisdom is characterized by what we could define as potentia existendi, an all-enveloping self-satisfaction, acquiescentia, arising from the idea of God as an eternal cause. This cognitive stage, by virtue of which the mind is finally able to understand in a clear and distinct way, finally leads to a Helchian serenity, to a bliss in which the human mind laps the infinity of God, and by virtue of which the mind experiences a symphony with all reality, since love of God means love of nature. This love that Spinoza speaks of is therefore aimed at all the individual entities of nature, but it is an intransitive love, since nature cannot reciprocate it. On a page of his Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, Goethe expressed this condition very well when he has one of his characters say, "If I love you, what does that matter to you?" So, intellectual love, the knowledge of things, as Raymond Baudet says, is the attempt to overcome both the passivity given by the passions and the imagination and the activity of conquest by an abstract reason that wants simply to enslave passions. It is the attempt to fit into a context in which all beings are recognized as having equal dignity. Hegel, for his part, in the preface to his Phenomenology of Spirit, states that the time has now come for philosophy to lay aside the title of love of knowing and be actual knowing, so that while for Spinoza the highest possibility of knowledge on the part of humanity is somehow one with the potentia of love for God, of course, for Hegel, far from being the supreme condition, love is rather the premise, we could say, or in a Stendhalian way, the promise of truth. But if this is true, does this mean that there is no place for love in absolute knowledge, that it is not possible, so to speak, an amor spiritus? From a certain point of view, the answer is affirmative, since for Hegel, and this applies both to the theological writing and to the Hegel of the Encyclopedia, for example, I quote, "In love, one finds life itself as a duplication of itself and as its unity." End of quote. Since it is precisely the feeling, Empfindung, of unity through which that being by oneself within the other, by sich selbst sein im anderen, that Hegel writes in several passages of his works is possible. In short, love can truly be seen as the first formulation of the Hegelian dialectical concept as a development or articulation of totality, which makes love itself probably the feeling of totality, of oneness. However, although love also plays an important role in Hegelian philosophy, it is, quote, still incomplete nature, writes Hegel. Rather, love represents only a moment or a stage in that process of negation and reconciliation, Versöhnung, into unity. One of its main limitations concerns the inability to resolve objectivity. Love, in fact, whether it aims to contract into a restricted sphere in a locus amenus, or we could say, or whether it aims to extend itself more and more to include the whole of humanity, runs away an inevitable destiny, in the sense that in the first case allows an immeasurable field of objectivity to exist outside itself, which comes to be configured as an unresolved opposite. While in the second, conversely, that is, if love wanted to extend to the whole of humanity, it betrays its nature, which is the concreteness and determination of its existence, its impossibility of turning to abstraction. A thought, writes Hegel, cannot be loved. But this leads to the second great limit of love, namely the absence of the negative, understood, for instance, in the declination of the fatigue of the concept, Mühe und Anstrengung des Begriffs. Also for this reason, as Hegel writes, I quote, lovers do not know of their union, because they, end of quote, because they do not know what love is. And moreover, love resists every intellectual construction, so much so that in the outlines of the philosophy of right, Hegel writes that love is therefore the most prodigious contradiction which the intellect cannot resolve. This implies that the absolute knowledge can only be love as feeling, and also that in love as love, the spirit does not know itself entirely, and by not knowing itself, likewise, it does not reach perfect fulfillment. That is to say, it does not completely resolve the relationship between relation and opposition, between thought and being, necessity and freedom, union and non-union, and so on. Love, therefore, needs to be pushed towards further unifications. Even in this case, in Hegel we can see a reworking of the Spinozian formula sed intelligere, since truth as wholeness, as das Ganze, can only correspond to dialectical movement and self-transparency of the idea, of which the feeling of thought, certainly sublime, represent only one stage. Now, if at the top of Hegel's epistemological pyramid there cannot be an amor spiritus, that is, if love cannot constitute the end of this path, this means not only that philosophical and scientific knowledge has a culmination, but beyond that, it means also that it no longer tends towards any truth, since it is itself the realized truth. But this implies a series of problems. For example, the question of truth as resultat. Can what resulted in turn be the moment advent of a subsequent result, such as, for example, 100 be the result of 80 plus 20, and the advent of the result of 120? Because if this is the case, the truth is never whole, never complete, and we risk falling into the trap of bad infinity, since its wholeness is incessantly pushed forward again. Or should we believe those who understand this entirety and this wholeness as the end of philosophy and its transformation into the history of philosophy and pedagogy? Must we believe that philosophical activity has dried up to the point that it does not allow the emergence of a new philosophical initiative, even a radical one? No historian of philosophy, moreover, at least I think, would reduce 20th century speculation to this form of philosophical servility. But the main problem that interests me, correlated to that of the result and implicit in that of love, is that of the eternal and its relationship with time. Spinoza's amor dei intellectualis, in fact, is a knowledge sub specie aeternitatis. Now, Spinoza has a simultaneously dualistic and monistic conception of time, apparently. He is a dualist because he admits a true eternal time, and therefore probably beyond the temporal horizon, and a fictitious temporality, linked to the impressions and erroneous imaginations of the mind. If the first time is that of eternity, the second is instead that of duration. The latter, however, exists only in appearance. Its condition of existence, in fact, falls entirely in the human mind that imagines it. Duration, therefore, does not have its own autonomous ontological status. When I think about the relationship between the eternal and duration, Dante's verse inscribed on the entrance door to Inferno always comes to mind. E io eterno duro, and I eternal last. That of duration is the time of hell. For Spinoza, as can be read as well as in his letter on the infinite, in the Ethics, time, considered absolutely, i.e. as eternity, is, quite quote, the very essence of God, as it implies his necessary existence. And therefore, to conceive things under the aspect of eternity, it is to conceive them as real by virtue of the essence of God. That is, insofar as their existence is implied by it. Past 5, demonstration 30. Eternity is the infinite affirmation and self-position of God. Is being causa sui, coincidence of essence and existence, and therefore existence eternally present in every presence and every present, extremely far from everything and still immanent to everything. Hegel, in his lectures on the history of philosophy, offers a clear interpretation of this Spinozian conception. He sees in Spinoza's eternal substance a sort of modern eleatism, a rigid and abstract universality incapable of saving individuality and modus in general from the abyss of substance, which would absorb or completely cancel it. Not a night yet, but perhaps an evening in which most of cows are grey. Said en passant, it is curious to know that Schelling, to whom this famous expression of Hegel alluded, also had a similar opinion on Spinoza. In his Munich lectures, in fact, Schelling maintains that, I quote, Spinoza's substance passes into the object with entire loss of itself, and therefore completely and without reserve, and only as such, as object, it is still encountered. That subject, however, is not blind, but an infinite position of itself. That is, it does not cease by becoming an object to be a subject. End of quote. And also Fichte, and therefore with him all the greatest exponents of German idealism, I thought he holds Spinoza in very high regard, and so do Schelling and Hegel, of course. The Fichtean I, in fact, is nothing other than a pure self-producing or self-creating activity. And it is identified by Fichte with Spinoza's substance. Even Fichte, I was saying, addresses a single objection to Spinoza, namely that he has placed pure consciousness beyond empirical consciousness, while it must be placed and recognized precisely in the latter. The I of each person is itself the only supreme substance, says Fichte. But again, returning to the problem I mentioned earlier, how should Hegelian absolute knowledge be conceived? Since if it leads to a cognitive stasis, then it falls back into Spinoza's immobile and acosmic knowledge. But if it is dynamic, sic et simpliciter, it therefore ceases to be knowledge. In fact, if Spinoza's eleatism leads to an eternal and immutable truth, just as the chain of necessary events, and if Hegel, for his part, intends to reject precisely this fixity, then all that remains is to ask ourselves what is ultimately the relationship between das Ganze, between the worldness of truth and time. In short, if absolute knowledge must not be static, absolutely objective or geometric knowledge, does this perhaps mean that philosophy must rather be sub specie temporis? Hegel himself, after all, in a famous passage of his Outlines of the Philosophy of Right, writes that philosophy is our time comprehended in thoughts. Yet it was said earlier that absolute knowledge is a realized truth, a knowledge in which subject and object find their Versöhnung, and in which there is no longer any tension, that is, no love of knowing. At the top of Spinoza's ontology, inversely, we find love, which leads us to suspect the existence of a chiasmus between Hegelian and Spinozian philosophy. To put it in Hegel's words, in his system there is an undribbled restlessness, haltungslose Unruhe, which precipitates us into a quiet result, ruhiges Resultat, sense of logic. While in Spinoza, exactly the opposite would happen. All this clearly depends on an improper understanding of the absolute knowledge itself. Here again, among others, for example, states that the end of the system, far from constituting its closure, on the contrary, represents the moment of maximum opening. But why? Because in it, Hegel establishes the need for externalization or alienation and transition, Entäußerung und Übergang, and with this he attests that the truth would be articulated in time, no longer beyond it. Once this immanence has been established, the determination of truth develops according to states that do not ignore subjectivity, but which are actually one with the history and development of the latter. This is precisely the unrest of life, Unruhe des Lebens, which is spoken of at the beginning of Phenomenology. Spirit is indeed never at rest, writes Hegel, a restlessness which constitutes the essence of that absolute differentiation which is time. But it is consciousness itself, continues Hegel in the Phenomenology, that is absolute dialectical unrest, absolute dialektische Unruhe, so that consciousness and time seem to be inextricably linked, to the point of mutually mirroring each other. Only the totality of spirit, we read in the Phenomenology, is in time, and the shapes, which are shapes of the totality of spirit, display themselves in a temporal succession. For only the whole has true actuality, and therefore the form of pure freedom in face or another, a form which expresses itself as time. End quote. This restlessness, for which we can unite, as we can read in the lectures on the history of philosophy, in mooring for this universal transience, and indeed in the indignation of the good spirit for such a spectacle, which cannot be compensated by any conciliatory result. However, at the same time, it reveals us our elevation, our being one or at home as spirit with the truth itself. Concrete, current existence in all its liveliness is therefore saved or maintained in its totality, in an horizon in which even the life of a shepherd, of a farmer, has an infinite value. Lectures on the history of philosophy. The final moment of Hegelian philosophical system is therefore certainly intensive on the one hand, in the sense that the result of an entire process is deposited in it, and it is finally available for its conceptualization. But at the same time, it is extensive, since in it the openness towards the future wanderings of truths is manifested. As we can see, although it does not lead to a knowledge that is directly involves love, absolute knowledge, paradoxically, is more open than Spinoza's amor, since in it there is no static or geometric objectivity in which to be reflected, but a constantly evolving process. But now, it is appropriate to focus in conclusion precisely on this aspect, since once it has been demonstrated that the moment of completion of the system is in reality the moment of its maximum opening, it is also crucial to prevent the truth understood as externalization and transition from reproducing precisely at the peak of the system that bad infinity against which it fought in every single part. Furthermore, this problem is linked to another question which can be summarized by asking whether truth, being inseparably connected with time, is not thereby also refuted by time, and therefore whether these truths, as often happens to their thinkers, do not escape the unfortunate fate of being considered only sons or daughters of their time. The answer to these questions, in my opinion, is only one, which, however, is articulate on several levels. Let's start by saying that for Hegel, saying that truth unfolds in time does not mean at all that it is temporary and therefore subject to time. I have collected here a series of passages in which Hegel reiterates this peremptorily. Time belongs only to the finite. Philosophy's timeless understanding, also with respect of time and things in general, according to their eternal determination, and so on, and so on. How then can truth, not changing over time, nevertheless be continually developing an Übergang? This happens because, as Kierkegaard writes, the sublation of every opposition does not mean arriving at a beatific and immobile unity, at a colorless absoluteness, but rather accepting the only permanent stable structure of becoming and what is finite. I quote, "What is not driven by any difference is differentiation. What is constant and permanent is the transition." End of quote. This process is what Hegel in the Science of Logic called the vanishing of the vanishing itself. To say it with Spinoza, the concept of dog does not bark. That is to say, the idea, the spirit is above time, since what is such in every concept of time, the idea is the thought of what is the substance of time. In this sense, then, while expressing the truth of one's time and comprehending it in thoughts, simultaneously the spirit, to say it with Hölderlin, is the world of all worlds, the all in all which always is, only presents itself in all time. Each new configuration of spirit in history, therefore, and this can also be applied to Hegel's own epoch, is only a limited configuration within the cosmic realization of the Logos, we could say, passing through every epoch and seeking in each of them only itself. In every historical era, it is the Logos which returns to itself, finding and comprehending itself in art, religion, and philosophy, and thus manifesting within time their timeless content. Its task is to work on the transformation into spiritual form of time, world, individual, and state, to develop itself so that it should come to the consciousness of itself within these realities. For this reason, in my view, the history of philosophy cannot be considered a gallery of opinions, since it is rather the articulation or progression of a single truth. I think, for example, of the beautiful images of the plant refuted by the flower in the Phenomenology. In this way, the unrest of time and life is assumed in the stillness of the spirit absolute, in which, however, eternity is nothing other than a becoming eternal of time, or, as Hegel says, a resolution of the finite into the eternal. Therefore, humanity can in some way make itself universal, immortal, emerging above the tumultuous and conflictual horizon of universal history into the serene, even if supremely mobile and restless, ether of eternal truth, of absolute spirit. I would like to conclude by a beautiful reflection by Thomas Mann, contained in a short essay from 1952, entitled Lob der Vergänglichkeit, known in English as Life Grows on the Soil of Time. Because when I happened to read it, it immediately brought to mind the Hegelian meditation on time that I tried, I hope not too clumsily, to remember. What I believe, what I value most is transitoriness, Vergänglichkeit. But is not transitoriness, the perishableness of life, something very sad? No. It is the very soul of existence. It imparts value, dignity, interest to life. Transitoriness creates time, and time is the essence. To man, time is given like a piece of land, as it were, entrusted to him for faithful tilling, a space in which to strive incessantly, achieve self-realization, move onward and upward. Yes, with the aid of time, man becomes capable of wresting the immortal from the mortal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Questions? Okay, Buena.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. Love and truth, always a good topic. I have 2 comments and 2 questions. And I'll talk more about Hegel's concept of love. It seems that Hegel has a kind of 2 lines of argumentation on love. The first one is taking the other as one's equal into a kind of unification. It goes well with some kind of unification union. Let's take, for example, marriage. So formal symmetry between the parties involved would, in principle, support a demand for equality within marital union. And however, he says such equality is not actualized and thus remains abstract if it does not include a differentiation between individuals, even if this then leads to discrepancies in resources, power, and of course, division labor. So in principle, equality, but this equality manifests itself quite differently for men than, for example, for women. So this is one kind of conception of love, mostly presented in the philosophy of right as absolute capacity or a power of unification, and it's interesting that he compares that to the general concept in logic. So this is one thing, and the other, there is another line of argumentation where love means so one individual in love does not take as one's equal, but as opposed to oneself. And this is the quote you brought in the talk. So it is opposition and not fusion that makes love what it is, and it cannot be redeemed to any sort of unity. So this is another one. So I'm interested, how do you stand on these 2 conceptions in Hegel? And of course, love and truth, one cannot but think of, but you, of course. So do love as a procedure of truth, as a construction of a world from the perspective of the 2. So I'm just interested, could you in any way connect it with your talk? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very beautiful question. I don't know if I'm able to answer properly. How I stand. I would say that I don't know how I was well, maybe something that is a bit problematic, at least in my view, is the problem of the negative in love. I don't know what kind of relationship Hegel had, but in my experience, at least, negative is an important part of love, and so it is inside of love. So this maybe is a bit problematic to me to understand. So why, for Hegel, there is apparently, at least, there is this lack of negativity in love, and that is a thing that I really am not able to reconcile, to understand, to for the other things. Yes, I would say that I totally agree. It is very complicated to follow this path, according to which, at the end, at the peak of the system, love can be present also only as a feeling because of this. Because of all the problems I mentioned before, namely the problems of the objectivity and so on. And honestly, I'm not able to answer on how this is, on how this problem of objectivity affects love, intended as marriage and intended as love union and sexual. The difference of sex and so on. So I have also problems with this point in particular. But if I think to the whole structure of love in Hegel philosophy, yeah, I would say that I agree with your observation, which are really insightful, and of course also with the general Hegelian structure, I would say. I have sincerely very few things to add.
Okay, so Professor Quingen, and then Luca, and then Gregor, and then Zdravko. So, but 10 minutes, so please, everyone be brief.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I liked, among others, the way how you described the limits of the model of love with regard to the problem of speculation. My question is maybe rather technical, and maybe it's also based on a misunderstanding. So I had the idea that you are of the opinion that for Hegel, philosophical cognition is absolute knowledge.
Philosophical, sorry?
Philosophical cognition is absolute knowledge, absolutes Wissen. You try to describe philosophical knowledge as absolute Wissen. That's correct, right?
Absolute knowledge as the culmination, you mean?
Yes. So, as so to say, the culminant point of culmination. Yeah. Then I would like to make a critical remark, because I think that's not the case. I think philosophical cognition for Hegel is not absolutes Wissen. Although it sounds, of course, very deep and dark, and it's a nice talk, but from a technical point of view, I think it's important to see that it's not the case. Because what happens is, absolute knowledge at the point of culmination of phenomenology of spirit is, so to say, the entrance ticket into philosophical cognition. So I would suggest to maybe deepen a bit this concept of philosophical cognition, and what you could do then is look at the idea chapter of the Logic, where the idea of cognition is developed by Hegel, and you will see that Hegel determines philosophical cognition, starts the determination in terms of theoretical and practical cognition, concluding that philosophical cognition is neither theoretical nor practical cognition. So there is no practical philosophy, there is no theoretical philosophy, there is only philosophy as knowledge of the absolute idea. So philosophical cognition is cognition under or in terms of the absolute idea. And then, so to say, you find, of course, formulations with regard to the cognition of the philosopher. Hegel talks, for example, of comprehending thought. But also that is not absolutes Wissen. So, yeah. Therefore, I would suggest maybe to, in this point, be more precise.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm sorry. I needed to express it more clearly. I'm sorry. Yes, you're right.
Okay. Look.
No.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to return to the point because I think that there is theoretical cognition and there is practical cognition, and absolutes Wissen contains theoretical and practical cognition. You told there is no theoretical cognition, there is no practical. No, there is, and they find itself into the absolute. Yeah. Okay. No, I wanted to. It is the last day of the talk of the conference, and I have to go away before the end, and so I can say something crazy. And it was a provocation from the wonderful talk I heard, and I have the impression that we can propose a sort of triangulation between Spinoza, Hegel, and perhaps Heidegger too. And this is crazy. and I was thinking about the relationship between time and eternity. Because the relationship between time and eternity and the relationship between finitude and infinity is, I think, the very focus, the very topic of the relationship between Hegel and Spinoza. And it is the very focus of the relationship between Heidegger and Hegel. And so Heidegger and Spinoza, I would say, in the sense that the problem is what is finitude and what is infinity. And there is this wonderful passage in the Vorlesung von Heidegger über die Phenomenologie des Geistes, where Heidegger says, okay, Hegel is the philosophy of infinity and I am the philosopher of finitude. But what is infinity for Hegel? It is not possible that this infinity is what I think as finitude, he says. And I think that your idea with the Thomas Mann quotation goes in this direction, but perhaps it's only crazy.
I totally agree.
You are crazy too.
Yeah. I totally agree. There is an interesting thought of Kojève, if I remember correctly, in some pages of his meditations on Hegel's dialectics, which are, in my opinion, very close to Heidegger, to the, in particular, regarding the closure, so to speak, between Dasein and the time for death. And because I remember these pages in which Kojève says that death, it is necessary also for the existence. It is not written this way, but maybe we could argue that, or we could interpret it in this way. Death it's necessary to infinity as well. So you have to die in order to. There must be death. There must be death in order to infinity to exist, because without death, finite cannot be finite or truly finite. And if finite cannot be truly finite, it cannot be also infinity as well. And yeah, in my opinion, there is, I expressed it very badly, but in my opinion, there is this conjunction, and it's a pity, it's a shame Heidegger didn't analyze it, at least in my opinion, it's a pity, because that would have been so interesting to know how he would have replied to this point.
I want to support the crazy totally and completely, not just as a crazy thought, but I think, especially, I also think that this quote by Thomas Mann expresses this idea really, really well. So I'm very happy that I want to thank you really very much for your talk. I appreciate it a lot, and it was really beautiful. And this quote is magnificent. So, to try to push the crazy a little bit would be to say, yes, I think Heidegger is not an innocent figure here, and I think Heidegger can help us, but can we do it even without Heidegger? Can we go to Spinoza and discuss amor Dei in this way? And let me give an example. So amor Dei, as we know, is a beautiful concept of our love of God is the God love of himself. But so my question would be this: is there any other way for God to love himself but through our loving him? This would be my Heideggerian question, or my Thomas Mannian question posed to Spinoza.
Yeah.
Is there any other way for God to love himself, if not through our love to him?
The only thing I can think of right now is a page of, if I remember correctly, Schelling, Freiheitsschrift, in which Schelling reflects things about Spinoza's conception, and not only Spinoza's conception of love, amor, because God can only love him in itself, and it's like circular love, and this love is only within the divinity. While for Schelling, if I remember correctly, this is the this could be called, because I don't remember the exact word, this could be called the bad love, because we spoke of bad infinity, the bad love, the love which is self-centered. And Schelling tries to depict this image of God as love, as pure love, but love is intended here differently, not as love of itself, love of God as the love of itself, but self-reflecting love. It's the love for the otherness as such, and this is the love that permits freedom to exist, for Schelling at least. And this could be one path to follow in order to answer to this intriguing question. But can we do it without Heidegger? I don't know. It's also an intriguing question, but yeah, maybe we should analyze the different concept of truth, all by Hegel, Heidegger, Spinoza, of course, because Heidegger analyzes very deeply this concept, and also Hegel's concept of truth, differently from the problem of death, in my opinion. And yeah, that would be illuminating, maybe, no? Right? The problem of Unverborgenheit, I remember, yeah. Unverborgenheit and absolute knowledge. That would be interesting.
Okay, Zdravko, real quick.
Very quick one. I was late, that was implied, and perhaps my question misses the point because everything was already said. But if I understood you correctly, you used the concept of love as an interpretive filter to contrast the position of Spinoza on one hand and Hegel on the other hand. However, there is a curious passage in the logic of concept that goes in a completely different direction. It's about das Allgemeine. And goes, das Allgemeine ist der Herr der freien Macht. Es ist es selbst und greift über sein anderes über, aber nicht als ein gewaltsames, sondern das vielmehr in demselben ruhig und bei sich selbst ist. Wie es die freie Macht genannt worden, so könnte es auch die freie Liebe und schrankenlose Seligkeit genannt werden, denn es ist ein Verhalten seiner zu dem Unterschiedenen als nur zu sich selbst. Also die freie Liebe, die freie Macht, die freie Liebe, die schrankenlose Seligkeit. This is nonetheless, I would say, Spinoza. So we come to the point where precisely in the concept of love, we have so affinity, so intimacy almost between Spinoza and Hegel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, it's true. I agree. I'm sorry, and thank you for your question, for your observation. There is also a passage, if I remember correctly, in the Encyclopedia, in which Hegel correlates absolute idea, absolute knowing with amor, intellectualis, and Hegel establishes, it seems so at least, a perfect, almost perfect correspondence between the Spinozian conception of truth. But still, I think there is, so to say, a reminder, because also in the encyclopedia, always in the encyclopedia, Hegel says that, writes that, as I mentioned earlier, before, love is present, is not absent in the culmination of knowledge, in the absolute knowledge. But the problem is, does the absolute knowledge is a consequence of love of God or love for the absolute, or maybe the opposite occurs, that is, love as a feeling, as the feeling of wholeness, can be appeared in its authenticity only after the reaching of the absolute idea. And so in this sense, maybe love depends on absolute knowledge and not the opposite. And maybe it is in this direction that we can read that passage of the encyclopedia in which Hegel says this absolute knowledge as feeling is love, and as knowing is spirit, if I remember correctly. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.